everyone. Welcome to FutureGaze, the future of creative inclusion. If you are not on mute, please do make sure you are muted throughout this session, just to make sure there's no interruptions to our lovely speakers. My name is Zoe. I am the program manager at Creative Edinburgh, and we are a membership organisation that operates as a charity within the city of Edinburgh that supports all the creatives that sign up to us. We have over 6,200 members, and we're very fortunate that they're all amazing people. So today I'm not here to speak to you, though. I'm just here to help move things along in the chat. If you have any questions towards the end of the discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat on Zoom, which you can find at the bottom, or feel free to raise your hand and actually ask the question out loud if you'd like to. So we have live transcripts if anyone needs, so you can put your captions on as well. And I'll pass over now to Caroline, who will be speaking to Nicola Osborne and Melanie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you to all of you for attending today and being with us. I'm Caroline Parkinson, Director of Creative at Edinburgh Futures Institute. And we will be taking time out to reflect and consider on FutureGaze with Nicola Osborne and Melanie Hoyes today. So thank you for joining us. So grab your lunch, a coffee, a tea, sit back, try and relax, and let your mind wander with us as we consider and reflect and gaze into our future. And today we're looking at the future of creative inclusion. As you all know, creativity thrives on a diversity of voices, perspectives, and experiences. And we in the creative and cultural sector work towards widening access, inclusion, and diversity in our industry and representation in the creative work we produce on the stage and in the theatre and the screen, etc., and in our audiences. So how are we doing as a sector in achieving a positive difference? How well are we tackling the challenges to achieving greater diversity and inclusion? What are our strategies? How successful have we been in the initiatives we have designed? Is there a greater need to share our learning, and how can we improve to achieve our aims? In this FutureGaze, our speakers will explore those questions and share what they've learned from their experiences and challenges, with examples of strategies and initiatives that have achieved a positive difference. So welcome to our speakers today. I'll introduce them one by one, starting with Melanie Hoyes from the British Film Institute. Since completing her postgraduate studies and teaching film and TV at undergraduate level, the BFI has given Mel the opportunity to use these skills in a contemporary industry context. She completed a BFI research project to historically map ethnic diversity in on-screen representation in UK film for the Black Star season at the BFI South Bank in 2016. And groundbreaking research and data methodology, which was written up in a piece in Sight and Sound magazine, and an academic collection of essays called Black Film, British Cinema 2. In her role as Head of Inclusion at the BFI, Melanie advocates for increased access and equity in the UK film sector, as well as consulting and collaborating with global partners to embed diversity and inclusion into policy and practice. She also sits on various boards and committees and is the Europe Council lead for the Gina Davis Institute and co-editor of the Black Film Bulletin section in Sight and Sound magazine. So welcome, Melanie. Fantastic to have you. Thank you for coming along today to speak with us.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And of course, Nicola Osborne of Creative Informatics, who might be well known to some of you. Nicola is the manager of the Institute for Design Informatics at the University of Edinburgh and programme manager for the Creative Informatics Cluster Programme, which is situated within the Institute. She authored the Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Policy for the programme and co-authored the Ethics Guidance, and regularly works with SMEs to ensure their innovative work is inclusive and ethically grounded. Nicola is a board member for The Space and a member of the Turing Institute Humanities and Data Science Interest Group, amongst others. She's an experienced speaker and performer, and performs with the Cabaret of Dangerous Ideas at the Edinburgh Fringe on the subject of data, but in a humorous way.
Yes.
So welcome to you, Nicola.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So welcome to you both and to everyone. So now we're settled down, eyes down. So this is a huge subject. And I know that we can't cover everything we'd like to or everything you would like us to touch on today. We're going to look at what our speakers have been doing, their strategies, their initiatives, and examples of what has worked. And we hope that sharing that will help you in your work. And so, unfortunately, that is potentially the limit of today's conversation, but we hope it will be helpful. So, welcome to you both. I'm going to dive in with a data question. What would you expect from EFI, the Data Driven Hub? At the last FutureGaze, we discussed creative impact, and some in the audience may remember that. We touched on the lack of freelance data. Another issue that came out was some of our work has impacts that go unreported, and there's no opportunity to tell the whole story because they just don't ask us for those things. So we might be measuring things that no one seems to ask us for. So we thought, well, that's a missed opportunity. So when we talked about what is the value of what we're measuring, and are we helping each other and funders and policymakers by giving what they ask for rather than what they don't ask for, and should we get a chance to tell the whole story? That led me to think about this subject. Inga Peniels at the last FutureGaze said there is incomplete data on the sector, and therefore the policy decisions are being made on flawed or incomplete data. And of course, that's problematic. Which led me to think, are we in that situation here? Or are we in a different sort of situation? It feels like we collect a lot of EDI data. Even filling out the Eventbrite to join a meeting has a long EDI list. And our funding applications, which many of us in this conversation will be aware of, and our reporting back to funders, our event attendees, our course participants, our audiences. So I feel like there's a lot of data as compared to what we have on freelance. But is it telling the whole story? And is it helping us to see if we're making a difference? Nicola, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, it's a good question. We collect a lot of data, so because our project, Creative Edinburgh, is always about getting creatives to use data in new ways. So we always knew our own data had to be kind of pretty great in terms of what we're collecting. And it's quite hard to know what the right data is to collect around equality, diversity, inclusion. So there are lots of different best practices. So there are best practices. There are lots of different ones. Terminology in the space changes. So we started our program in 2018. Some of the choices of what fields we put in and how we articulate the kind of data we collect should change, but actually to do a comparison of the data, it then becomes hard if you change those fields. So that's kind of interesting, particularly around kind of how one might articulate gender, for instance, on those forms, and what we might want to ask people to disclose or not disclose about them. So there's a challenge anyway, even as one organisation collecting data, but as a sector, it's really challenging because everyone collects different kinds of EDI data. For ethical reasons, that's usually an optional field, so you don't get a full picture of everyone's data, and it's quite interesting who's motivated to complete that information and who isn't. And there's some organisations are really good about being transparent in what they publish. I know BFI is great about that, and we try to be very good about doing that ourselves because we think it motivates people to understand why you're asking for the data if you share that back to them. But there isn't any one way to sort of check across the sector. There isn't a full picture of everyone who is participating and everyone who is excluded from participating. And it is very difficult to kind of have a complete picture of that. But there's a lot more that we could do with the data we've already collected, I think, and looking at how we could map data across different organisations and make it more comparable or use the same best practices potentially across different areas. I can see that Zoe shared our EDI policy and action plan for creative informatics. That shares how we approach things and the kind of data we collect. We will be putting out a report really soon, actually, that explains how we have done on that, sort of reflecting back on what's gone well, what's gone less well, and how it's compared to other clusters and things. But yeah, we have a lot of data. Putting it together into a richer picture is still a kind of gap to be done. And the research around that shows there are big gaps in terms of who's participating.
Yeah. And what about for yourself, Melanie, at the BFI?
Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot of data around people that access us for funding, but that is a relatively narrow field at the same time. So I think this idea that Nicola was talking about consistency is an issue because it is really bitty. We don't have any kind of wholesale way of collecting data across the sector. During COVID, we were asked how many freelancers we had to support, and we couldn't even answer that question. So I think, the sort of freelance nature of our industry makes that really difficult to do in a holistic way. And we're always trying to do better. We do okay at it, but I'm always trying to think about ways to do better. What I would say is I think data is important and it holds accountability. We report data based on targets that we have, and it allows us to see where we are and where it is we'd like to get to, where areas of work we need to do in specific areas that are being underrepresented. But I also just sort of think we know. So like you could have all the data in the world to tell us how terribly underrepresented people are, but we know that is happening. So I do think without data, without action, and without a kind of understanding of that and a will to push that forward, is sort of doesn't really mean anything. It's superficial, and it just says, oh look, oh isn't it terrible all the time. So I think there's that too. Like we get hung up on data, and it is really important and it does hold accountability. But I do think we need to start talking about, well, we just accept that it is bad, and how do we move forward?
But in terms of improving a bad picture, you do need a benchmark. You need the baseline. Even if the benchmark says this, and the next year it says this, or it goes like this, and it's not this, well, it's still telling you something. And I think that what I was trying to allude to is the progress. Yeah. Instead of just numbers and characteristics of our numbers, what is the progress? Not just numbers, but what are the stories? And is there a difference being made?
And that qualitative data is also really important.
Right.
So also looking to talk to people about their experiences and taking that into account. Really interested in, we've just rolled out our inclusion targets across all of our activity, all of our internal activity. They are not there to sort of hold a red pen to people's activity. What I'm interested in is what interventions, how is that inspiring you to do things that might reach people that you wouldn't normally be reaching? And what does that look like, and how can we learn from that? So I think that is an important picture, and the sort of intersectionality of that data as well is really important. So I think data is really, don't get me wrong, it's started in this business. I think it's really important, but I do think there is a point at which we were all talking about data like that was diversity, and that isn't. It's just, that is kind of basic foundations to the work and to sort of what we want to achieve.
And that's what you're then building on. And so I wanted to ask you, in your work, day to day, what are you finding that you are the hardest challenges that you're tackling and achieving? Greater diversity and inclusion. Nicola, you had an interesting perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I think we had been doing a lot of monitoring of data, and we were aware of where we had kind of gaps in who we supported. So because we've been giving out funding for different projects, we knew that we were doing quite well in terms of gender diversity, quite well in terms of a diversity of people from different ethnic backgrounds and things. We were doing really poorly on people from lower socioeconomic areas, kind of working class people in less privileged positions. And then we had an opportunity to come up with some additional funding earlier this year. So we actually designed some calls specifically around kind of inclusive work in partnership with the Creative Community Hubs network in Edinburgh. And they work specifically with organisations that are embedded in communities in less privileged areas, which meant that rather than us trying to build up a network of people who we wanted to target, who we didn't have any relationships with, we could work with them as partners to then get word out to organisations that would truly make a difference with funding and things. And so it's been really, really excellent to have the opportunity to think from scratch. Okay, we got £250,000 of funding. What can we do with that to really have a very inclusive definition for equality, diversity, and inclusion in terms of relevance for projects? So as a criteria in our funding, rather than a thing we're measuring alongside our normal funding criteria, because normally we'd have that kind of information as a monitoring thing rather than as a core criteria. So we made it a core criteria and used a very inclusive definition. So including people who are carers, including people who are refugees, who are ex-offenders, who are care leavers, in addition to all of the categories you'd normally expect to see there, and particularly emphasising the desire to people from less privileged backgrounds and communities in less privileged areas. Mm-hmm. And that's just been a very... Having done that for this particular call, it's made me kick myself for not having done some of that stuff in previous funding calls in terms of how we work the criteria. And there are various reasons why we didn't do that, but we did emphasize other kinds of diversity characteristics in how we showed a successful project, or who we chose to showcase to show that there are diverse founders of startups, there are diverse entrepreneurs in the creative industries. But it was a really fascinating process to do, and doing things like to attend a workshop to find out about the funding. We were able to design the call and design the use of the funding to cover childcare costs or travel costs if you needed to get to those things. So, and so we've been able to do that a bit around the edges of people who've received some of that as well. And being able to do that in projects and seeing what a difference that makes to who participates immediately makes you realise how important it is.
So you're designing with the community that you want to support.
Yes.
And so there's an element of co-creation, consultation before you do the design.
And it's always learning from the feedback we get. So as Manny said, the kind of qualitative experience of people is so important to then actually doing things better. So we always use sort of partnership forums to get feedback on what we're doing badly, and people have been delightfully honest with us about that, which is really genuinely appreciated.
Yes,
helped us change things.
Yes.
And it helps us make it much clearer what information we do or don't need, or how that information is used, what we can do to make things more accessible, and how we can explain why we're not doing some things that might make things more accessible but would also make them less fair. For instance, application formats and stuff that fall into that category.
Of course.
So it's been very much about responding to what works and then trying other things out and trying to be as inclusive as possible in definitions to make it clear that this thing is for you. For a lot of different use, rather than expect it to look just like what everyone expects an entrepreneur to look like or a creative to look like or whatever. Yeah.
And what about in your work, Melanie, at the BFI? What are you seeing as the hard challenges in your line of you're delivering your strategy?
So many challenges. It's so many. I think one of the big ones for our sector is kind of the fact that it's a largely freelance industry. There's very little. There is no regulation in film in particular. So a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is just to sort of ask nicely or show best practice without, so we have a kind of way to funnel people through the values and the things that we would like them to do when they're applying to us for funding. But there is a much larger industry to tackle that we don't have that kind of stick to be able to get them to do those things. So I think a lot of that is challenging, in that a lot of what I do is advocacy or sort of trying to get our house in order and show best practice. But that is really tricky, that in comparison to other sectors, there aren't those structures with which to sort of guide people to do this work in the right way. And the very sort of nature of the way that we crew up and get people on board for projects is just not regulated. It's not in line with the way that employment law works. It's a lot of people just picking up the phone to people that they've worked with before. So that is really challenging to disrupt, because if we just continue to do the same things that we've done, you get the same results. And so that's a really challenging thing to disrupt. And in terms of, people understanding what transferable skills are, and that you can have worked in advertising and still be on a film set, and it's not like this huge chasm of stuff that you need to learn. So I think there's a lot of that, a lot of kind of misconception about what this work means, how difficult it is, what needs to happen. And largely that's because it's freelance. And I think there's just a lot of fear. I think there's a lot of fear in talking about things, in how we approach subjects, in how we talk about groups, about offending people. And I think that is a huge challenge when you are trying to just get people to sort of be honest and view these as like creative opportunities as opposed to problems or risks. So that is an issue, I think, for sort of holistic change across the board.
Yeah. And I recall when we were discussing this before today, I'm about to ask you about what are your strategies. And Melanie, you said your strategy was based on what has failed before. So when you mentioned, errors or failures in your last answer, it made me think about what you'd said about how you were building a strategy. So would you like to share with us what your strategy is moving forward? I know you're writing a new one for the BFI.
Yeah, I mean, EDI kind of sits as one of the main strategic pillars of our overarching corporate strategies alongside environmental sustainability and UK-wide strategies. So within that, I think I'm just really used to working in failure because I think that's what, essentially what diversity and inclusion is change management. It's trying to shift systems and ecosystems that aren't working for various groups of people. And in this instance, it's the majority, the people that sort of are allowed opportunities in our industry are a very small minority of the entire population of the world. What we're trying to do is include everyone else. So the problem with the work is that it could be infinite. So what I've tried to do, I think a lot of our strategies have been based on a deficit model, thinking about diversity and inclusion as something that we have to fix, that is broken. There aren't enough people. We can't find people. It's too difficult. People aren't interested. And rather thinking about how we embed this work into every single aspect of what we do as an organisation, which is quite wide reaching because we go from sort of archive and collections through to exhibition at the BFI. So thinking about what do those opportunities mean for audiences, for the people that we're trying to hire, for the people that we're trying to bring into the pipeline for the industry, and how our systems don't allow for those opportunities. What are those barriers and how do we unpick them? And then a lot of the strategy that I've written for my team is based on our own sort of psychological safety and work that doesn't make us feel like we're banging our head against a brick wall, that is based in sort of vibes, because a lot of this work is about how it feels. We know when it feels right. We know when people feel included, and that's really hard to evaluate in a sort of corporate way. But we know that it works, and we know that through utilising the systems that already exist, informal networks, kind of social events, all of that sort of thing, that we can bring our communities together in a way that they can begin to work with each other and sort of create amongst themselves, which has been working really well. And then also just thinking about, again, with that embedding, how we're disrupting the systems and the opportunities that the BFI already gives. So, for example, we already take international cohorts of producers to film festivals, but they're often not a very diverse group, or it's sort of the same pool of people that end up knowing that those opportunities exist and that are at the right level that we're looking for. And we've disrupted that by sort of creating groups that are specifically for Black and Brown producers. I'd love to take a disabled cohort of producers out to a festival. But what that means is we have to sit alongside those cohorts to disrupt every bit of the process that makes it impossible for them to join in the first place. So we look at the wording of the application. We look at what's being asked. If you're being asked for 2 features, very few producers at that level, kind of in the groups that we're looking at, have had that opportunity. So sort of just changing up what it is that we're asking for while still adhering to what those programs are for and about, and looking to increase co-production and things like that. We take them, we go with them, create community spaces while we're there, whilst introducing them to people, explaining what it's like to be in a market, what who you might want to speak to. So just, making sure that they have the finance to go. We're not assuming they can pay out before they go. So it's all of that, trying to bring our sort of consultative nature around what we know and what we understand the issues and barriers to be into the work that we're doing already as an organisation.
And that shows that you're also flexible in your processes in order to allow that to happen. So I'm loving that example. And there's practical barriers. So you've done the right communication, the right wording, the right outreach. It was like you said, it feels right. And then there's, I need childcare cover. I need not to work those days, but I'm freelance, so I need to cover that. And I can't pay it out, but then get it back on expenses. So you're going, okay, and you're making flexible, practical arrangements to reduce all the barriers you can think of. So Nicola, can you describe something in your strategy and how you would describe your strategy in creative informatics or even design informatics?
Yeah, I think actually that flexibility and that kind of scaffolding, that kind of here's the support and advice you need to not just get into a program, but actually thrive in it. Because I think it's much easier to recruit people in, and it's much harder to make sure they actually can take advantage of the opportunity for all of those practical reasons discussed, but also that sense of kind of belonging and wanting to feel like they understand enough to know they can go for different opportunities, or in our case, kind of follow on funding, or participate in events and things. So we do a lot of kind of support and scaffolding, and try to be very flexible with people that we're supporting to go for funding, whether it's ours or anybody else's. So for instance, if you've got people who are coming in with neurodiversities, the kind of long application forms are horrible. There are good reasons of transparency and fairness why we need to have the long application forms, but there is no reason why we can't help people deal with them. So that's what we've tended to do. So help people deal with them, help them look at the kind of the proposal process. We have a robust conflict of interest process to make sure that that works, if you see what I mean, so that people who are selecting are external, or the people who've been heavily involved aren't making those decisions. But so that kind of hand holding and support and empathetic behavior to individuals, so that they have an opportunity to understand what you're looking for. Like, I think a lot of the time with funding in particular, there's a feeling like it's a test you have to pass, and it's really not. Usually it's a kind of, here is what we want to see, and to succeed, you just need to tell us how you're going to meet all those things you need to see, but actually explain to people how their project fits into that, or helping them to understand that it isn't about trying to trip them up. It is about trying to help them articulate things in the right way. That makes a huge difference. And I think then when they're up and running on a project, we found that particularly our more diverse people, or people working with diverse groups, will face other kinds of delays and challenges sometimes. So sometimes that's a personal health thing, particularly if they have a disability or they care for somebody with a disability, or if they have a kind of mental health challenge, that can mean they want to defer a project for longer, and that's a much better outcome for everybody. So we've been able to build that kind of flexibility in. We've had people kind of who are in the process of transitioning genders, and that brings with it a lot of complexity and things that have meant flexibility on timelines have been invaluable to make that work for them. So I think it's being sort of responsive to that, and realizing that it doesn't need to be a brutal, like, succeed, fail thing. It's very much more about helping people to do well. And I know a lot of people who've done research on where there are gaps in terms of representation, big gaps in representation in the creative industries, for all kinds of different groups, actually. So Culture is Bad for You. The book came out sort of sharing a lot of different research into different kinds of diversity characteristics, and the absence of people with the characteristics in particularly senior positions in the creative industries, and also the work that the Sign Network have done, actually, in terms of sharing lived experiences of people who've often gotten into specialist ED&I training programs and things, or graduate schemes, but haven't been able to make that next step in their career, or find themselves kind of isolated. A lot of that is to do with that lack of follow-on or support or structure around it. So I think that's been the most sort of successful strategy that we found and that we're sort of using at the moment. Alongside, I mentioned earlier, celebrating and showcasing diverse projects and projects that are really supportive of inclusion in the kind of wider community. So, we choose how we program our events. We just did a huge innovation showcase, and we had 2 panels really that were about kind of community and inclusion that were really exceptional, actually, in terms of what they showed. But we chose to have, panelists and people that were very diverse and were happy to sort of share their experience as diverse people, as well as working on projects that are specifically reaching diverse communities. And we always do that. We always try and make sure that the people that we're showcasing and highlighting, they don't just look like the classic creatives or the classic tech bros, because we're working with data and technology projects. There is a particular kind of founder image in people's heads, and that often affects who gets funding out in the commercial investor world. They think someone looks professional because they turned up in a suit, and they don't think about all the layers of inequality that includes, and bias that includes. So we just try and make it really visible, the sort of this is what someone doing successful, interesting work looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to be massive scale. It's not necessarily going to, like, the person you're seeing is not going to look like all the other people you're used to seeing as success stories. And we'll help explain why that is a really good project, if that is something that is helpful to that individual, and we'll let them do it in the way they want to. We had one of our presenters a couple of weeks ago pre-record their presentations. They were on stage, but they pre-record the presentation to help them deal with anxiety and how they handle a situation as someone who is neurodiverse. That's easy to do. Why would we not do that?
Right.
but it's not always a thing that people will be happy to accommodate. And so I think it's, a lot of
I think what's coming out of what you're both saying is well, in a sense, your platforms or your funding providers or your opportunity providers, but the onus is on you to be as flexible as possible in giving that opportunity. And you're both doing that. And obviously, when you're designing and when you're delivering, you're trying to be as flexible as you possibly can within the system that you're part of.
Yeah, I think it's also being willing to be criticized by the people who you're failing, in a nice way. Like being open to feedback that allows you to improve, and have that be trusted enough to do that.
Yeah,
and
sometimes that's my favorite feedback, when it's completely passionate and in your face, and you go,
"Yeah,
this is real, and I can really tackle that problem that you're talking about right now." And I actually quite like that, because it's real, and you can deal with it, which is good. So I'm glad that you've touched on what works. You've talked about your strategy. You've also talked on elements that you've seen that are working, like that managed cohort going across to film production meetings or studio meetings or conferences, and you're hand-holding them and introducing them to the right players, and you're helping them, you're introducing them. So there's the confidence there, and there's support there, and you're in a way hand-holding them until they make their own relationship, and you're doing that with people that you trust. So that's really good, hand-holding and support. So the reason I was asking about what works is that's the main question in the Creative Majority Report. And it's interesting, Melly, you mentioned that, the minority and the majority. And then that report talks about that. And the statistics are quite stark. It was created in 2021. It was led by a cross-party group in Westminster Parliament, but it's supported by academic researchers, including our own Dave O'Brien, who you've already mentioned, Nicola, at the University of Edinburgh, but also King's College London, Paul Hamblin Foundation, NBC Universal. And I want to read a quote from it. It says, "Even where interventions have been successful, there is often no systematic record of the outcome or impact. The parliamentary roundtables and public consultation illustrated that despite multiple examples of individual interventions, there's an absence of any systemic industry-wide approach to inclusion. Sadly, as the discussion of the evidence revealed, we just do not know the answer to the key what works question in any systematic and well-evidenced way." So what that made me think about was, what can we do as a body here of cultural organisations, of creative companies, of creative freelancers in a network? What can we do to even share amongst ourselves what we have learned and help us all to move forward, even if there is no holistic platform at the moment where we can share everything that everyone said, "Oh, this works. So I was just wondering, what do you think about how we might share, Melanie, and how we might learn from each other?
I mean, I think things like this are a great start, aren't they? I think, I belong to a lot of networks. All I ever hear is that people want to share and collaborate and understand. And, we're open to that as a team. I know many other people who work in this space that are really, understand that the way to kind of move this forward is to share knowledge and not duplicate work and to collaborate. So I think that doing that in these spaces is absolutely the right way to go. That we're never going to fix anything holistically unless we're working together to do it. And I think the other thing about that report and the idea that things aren't happening holistically is because we often sort of do concentrate on kind of initiatives, and we're sort of like, we're going to do a thing. It's a new thing and no one's ever thought about that thing. And then, you find out 40 other people have done that thing. And yes, it's like helped people. But if we did that in a joined up way, what we're talking about, some of the foundations that we have to the work, the reason I'm able to kind of build on what doesn't work is because we have foundations of data. We have foundations of targets. We have our diversity standards. We have policies. We have things that are inbuilt into our funding as a kind of a matter of course, and that allows you to sort of play with other ideas whilst kind of keeping the wheels turning on what are long-term interventions. So rather than sort of panicking and thinking, oh, do this thing over here, and, you know, not thinking about how those people stay in the industry, even though you're bringing them in for a training course, that is the stuff that has made us kind of keep going forward and backwards and forward and backwards. And I think thinking more holistically, working together is the key to sort of doing this work across the board. And that requires reaching out and building up networks of people doing this work. And it's just sort of necessary. Like whenever I get in a room with people that think in the same way, or a sort of, or not, you know, like people who are going to challenge what it is that I'm doing and how I'm doing it, that is the change management that needs to happen. That is the way that you are able to kind of keep fresh and do this work properly. So I think just kind of reaching out, talking to people, you know, setting up workshops, thinking about problem solving, asking questions, that is all really useful work here, I think.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, as you're speaking there, Melanie, and about what you said earlier about the sector you're in is predominantly freelancers working to production companies, and how we might think about a structure that could be put in place to help in that particular instance. And I know, Nicola, there is a structure in the Creative Clusters programme called the PEC, the Policy and Evidence Centre, which was led by Nesta. So I'm just wondering if that's a useful sharing mechanism, or do we need to create our own mechanism here to share what works?
Yeah, I think there is. There are lots of networks, and there is a use for having a lot of those networks there. So, the Policy and Evidence Centre has been really useful. There has also been a kind of informal network across those clusters as well of sharing best practice, and particular clusters we've had particularly in-depth conversations with about it, where that's been a particular focus for them. There are lots of other networks that are out there, and I think those are really, really useful. I think people who are working in this space are quite good at looking out for what those networks are and what those communities are. One of the things when we were kind of preparing for today, and also sort of listening in again today, I guess the kind of success for me will be when the people who are sitting in the rooms around quality, diversity, and inclusion, under whatever set of headings you're using, don't all look themselves diverse. I think if we can get the kind of white middle-aged dudes with privilege in the room to think that's important to them as well, that would make the biggest of differences. Because I know one of the challenges, particularly looking at the various different reports we've mentioned already, is that people who have decision making and sort of leadership and strategic leadership roles are often the least diverse, even though the majority of people who are trained in those areas of the creative industries or working in those areas of the creative industries may be much more diverse. So I think that's the one thing I kind of don't have a good answer for how you do that, but I would really like to see that in terms of, I think if you had that start to happen, you would have a different level of buy-in for some of the kind of best practices that are there. But yeah, any kind of way in which we share what works or what doesn't work, so that you're not trying to start something from scratch every time. Like, it's at no point in any of the stuff that I've been doing have I started from scratch. I've been looking out to see what else is out there, and what I can see has worked well and what I can see has worked badly. And, you know, I think everyone in the room here has their own kind of diversity characteristics, so I will bring those in as well to my understanding of, like, do I think this data captures me appropriately? But also, who else what stories can't I figure out from looking at the data we get back? I think that's one of the most interesting things when you do have that baseline of data and that evidence base. It both allows you to track things, as Melanie's spoken about, and it also, you start to realize after a period of time what you're missing from that, what it doesn't tell you, or how you analyze that, whether that's telling you the right things. Like, it's really easy to collect different criteria, but it's quite hard to kind of map the intersectionalities between those different things, which where the quality of stuff comes in. You can start to see things where you realize you haven't captured the data in a format that allows you to tell the right story. And so there's always a kind of iterative thing, and then you want to kind of go and ask questions of other people doing this, going, how did you do that? Like, trying to work out the right proxy for sort of class and economic background and things. There's lots of different measures for that. No one, as far as I can see, has found the best one for that. So lots of different ones, and trying to work out which is the best one. That definitely requires like a discussion with people to work out, like, is that working for you? Do you think it captures the right people? Is that reaching the right kind of information? Yeah, those kind of conversations.
It sounds like we need to create a fora for this, a list of do's and don'ts, the stories of what has worked and what to avoid. We tried this and this was a mistake or a misstep, and what we learned from that and designed here. Key things you should do, co-design with the group you want to serve and help. Yeah. Have a diversity on your board, on your management, on your team that's creating these opportunities and deciding about them. It sounds like we need a repository or a place to have an opportunity to share with each other.
I think so. There's a temporal thing though, because things do change over time in terms of what's important and
yes, that's true.
Good performance looks like. And there's a regional thing as well. London looks really different from other parts of the UK, for instance. Right. Yeah, and there are some of these things already. I think that's the problem. That there are things. It's just connecting them all up.
And I do think that to that point, that a lot of this work is iterative and it changes all the time. Language changes all the time. We have language guides that we sort of publish freely, that we update, but it is iterative. It is constantly changing. I think part of the problem, as Nicola has sort of said, is that a lot of the time people working in this work are people that are passionate about it. Like I absolutely did not wake up at 6 years old and was like, I'd like to be the head of diversity for the British Film Institute. I wanted to be a vet and do other things and kind of, but you sort of end up there because you realize where there are issues. So a lot of the burden lies on people who are experiencing that discrimination or those barriers whilst they're trying to change them. And there does need to be, I do wonder about regulation and whether that is helpful in terms of kind of ensuring that is being held at the right level, because it does seem to fall on, it seems like something that's done on the side. And that is where I'm trying to move our work into the embeddedness of people who have the power to be able and the skill to be able to change what it is that's happening within my organisation. I don't have the resource or the people or all of the skills of everything that everybody does to be able to shift that and move it forward. So I think that kind of collective holding of this work and understanding that it is collective and it runs across everything we do is hugely important, and maybe regulation is the way to keep an eye on that.
I was about to ask, but I think you've actually highlighted a few things. Consistency of data, some structure where the freelance community can be supported to have best practice embedded, policy, potentially legislation. Now, I'm keen to hear your experiences of what has made a difference on screen, backstage, in the audience, in the creative company, with your publics. How are you seeing real changes in your sector? I mean, Melanie, the screen sector has been in the press a lot and that's moved things forward. I'm just wondering, what changes have you seen, if you have a case study to share an example? I think you mentioned, even with data, the Hollywood Diversity Report, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen a lot of changes on screen, and I think that is largely to do with sort of how awful the data was kind of 5 or 6 years ago, and how evident it was that this idea that we were representing just how things are wasn't even true. That wasn't right, and that wasn't what was happening. So it was clearly imbued with a huge amount of bias in terms of what was on screen. I'd like to see more of that off screen, and I think what is interesting is how moments that happen, like the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein, like the murder of George Floyd, kind of sort of bang open the door, because that sort of shame and accountability does hold people to sort of go, oh, we can't sort of pretend this isn't happening anymore. Unfortunately, it takes those moments to be quite useful to the work that I do and the conversations that I'm able to have and the rooms that I'm able to get into. But it does always feel like they kind of get banged open and then they're closing slowly, and you're just trying to sort of shove as many changes and people through the door before it shuts again and something else happens. So I do think there's a call for sort of more accountability, and more a kind of evaluation and keeping an eye on, which is where data does come in handy to sort of be like, you think anecdotally things are moving, but they're not. or not in any significant way.
Right.
So what are we doing about it? So I think that kind of allows for a bit more movement. And I think I think a more nuanced way of thinking about diversity and inclusion, because we often, those things open the door for a very like singular group of people. So it's all of a sudden, it's kind of like, we don't have enough Black people, there's not enough women. And, you know, without recognizing the kind of intersectionality and all of the reasons why people can't partake in our industry, highlighting one is kind of useful for a moment, but doesn't fix it for everybody. So I think sort of more nuanced ideas about what we mean about being diverse and inclusive would be really great. I feel like I'm answering your next question. I'm sorry, Caroline.
No, you're doing fantastic. You're doing fantastic. And Nicola, when we talked about this in preparation, we talked about, you know, what difference have you seen? And you said that you saw some progress in the queer creative companies that you've been working with.
Yeah, so I think for us it's been really important to do that. What a successful kind of entrepreneur looks like. Sort of having a different conversation around that. I think in terms of the kind of work we've showcased and sort of helping people imagine what some of those, what working with data looks like, that it doesn't just look like coding as well. And that factors quite a lot into that, who you see engaging, because it links into much wider kind of inequalities that exist in kind of STEM and STEAM sort of locations as well. So yeah, we've certainly had a lot of projects that have been doing really interesting work that are very in this kind of a space. So we had an award-winning, as a couple of weeks ago, project which was called FND Stories, which was an artist, Clancy Brooks, who worked with lots of people who suffered from functional neurological disorders, to try and bring their stories to life through the data around them. And that was using both quantitative and qualitative data. And so giving them a level of representation they hadn't really had before. And it was a very moving thing to have the exhibition on. So it was a piece of artwork. Obviously, it has a sort of commercial kind of long tail in terms of being exhibited in other places as artworks. But actually to see people who he'd spoken to come into that room and to actually do the ethics process around that was really, really interesting, to make sure that was going to be fair and how it represented those people, because it was going to be a small sample of people being talked to and that sort of thing. I think, you know, we've had a lot of projects that are looking at kind of data as well around how you make creative and other kind of spaces more inclusive. So we have someone called Stephanie Wilson, who set up a company called Fire, who's looking at making events communicate expectations and things better to be inclusive for
that's good.
Yeah, around kind of particularly people with neurodiversities rather than just physical disabilities, because there's a lot of really good best practice about physical disabilities, but the actual information stored about event details and venue details that just tell you where things are in the room and what to expect. That's really going to make a difference as well. So I think we have a bunch of examples of that ilk. And I think we've seen in our kind of numbers of applications and who we've been able to go ahead and fund a much more equitable picture, I guess, than in other kinds of startup and tech funding spaces. And I'm certain that's because we've explained what a project that looks successful this kind might look like.
Exactly.
Who are diverse, not the obvious picture of people. Yeah, I'm sure.
I think that's excellent, and I love what you're saying about that, about expectations, about what you're going to be participating in, and it's not just the physicality, but it's the neurodiversity of that, and what you can count yourself in. I'm going to go to this because I can manage. I'm being seen.
And that's part of those filling in the gaps. So knowing that you addressed some areas of ETI, and that in that case, the reason there's good information about physical access is because that is backed up by policy. Coming back to Melanie was saying, like, maybe there is a need to have policy requirements in there, but that policy requirement isn't in there for other kinds of diversities and accessing events. And that's part of the reason there is a gap there.
So definitely we've got more to do. I mean, we've known that right from the very start of this conversation. Everyone in this conversation today knows that. There's loads of work to do. But if we could take a positive breath and look to the future, what are your future plans ahead? What are you looking forward to getting your hands on? What would you like to see us as a creative sector do as we go forward? Or what would you like to see happen next in policy or politics, legislation or education? You know, this is just an open question. And before the floor is open for questions from the audience, just wanted to ask you, you know, what does the future look like for you? it could be your next step, or it could be what you'd like to see the next big jump be. The floor is yours. We would like to jump in.
I mean, ideally, I'd like to be worked out of a job so that I could go and sit on a beach.
Nice.
It would be really great if I meet people like me to be like, do some stuff. So I mean, that's joking aside. It's like in my strategy, that is what I would like to see, is that people kind of own this work and think in the same ways that we think as inclusion professionals around these barriers, and embed that into what they're doing, and just try and access and give opportunities to as many people as possible in a sort of as a humane way as possible, and sort of think about people as humans and individuals, and think about those things. And that would be the kind of dream. I'm not sure it will ever happen in my lifetime, but that is what we're working towards. And I'd like to see that happen. People just not be scared of it and sort of see it as the sort of joyful, abundant work that it can be. It's like, it could be really exciting to just meet people where they're at and find out about things that you just wouldn't think about normally, and try and problem solve how to make that better for them. It can be joyous.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's the joy of creative diversity, creating together. So before you end up with your pina colada on the beach, I'm just thinking about the immediate future for you. Is your new strategy? Is there anything in particular in that you're excited about coming up?
I'm excited about all of it. I think it sort of sets really foundational work to change the way that the BFI interacts with partners, that it interacts with people that are applying to us for funding, that are taking part in our programs. I just feel like that feels really exciting, having spent a lot of time kind of fighting fires and, in sort of panic mode. It feels really exciting to have a kind of real structured method of making our opportunities equitable, and making that available to the whole organisation, and setting best practice from that, and being able to sort of advocate around that to industry in a sort of more authentic way, rather than like, don't look behind me, I'm just telling you how to do it. So I think that feels really positive and exciting to me, in a sort of BFI that I think is changing and moving in that direction. To be part of that is really exciting.
And I know you'll be excited when you see the results of your work and the strategy in a year or 2 years' time. It'll be lovely to see that. Nicola, what about you? What are you thinking about in terms of your future plan ahead, or what you'd like to see the creative sector do ahead, or policy in this area?
I mean, I think, like Melanie, I would like this to not need to be a thing, but it does need to be a thing. I think for me personally, it's very much about kind of trying to embed all the sort of iterative bits that we learn into the next project better from the outset, and then improve it further, and being able to kind of share that experience with other people that I work with. So I'm based in the university, with other people around me in those projects in the university, but also with people in the creative sector. So that's, we shared our ED&I approach as an openly licensed publication to allow other people to go and remix it and reuse it. I think that kind of thing is important, to share data, but also share kind of methodologies, and sort of say, this isn't perfect, but it's there. It's a starting point. And so doing a lot more of that. I hope to kind of continue being quite open in what we do, so that it can be helpful to other people and we can learn from other people who've done the same thing. And just sort of embedding an expectation that you should see a diversity of people in any field, really. And that's both because it is the right thing to do, but also because you get much more interesting work out of it. You get infinitely,
of course, exactly, creative
and cultural work out when you have a real diversity of voices in. Seeing the same perspective reflected all the time is really boring. And I'm always very excited anything that is commercially successful, that is coming from a diverse perspective, because it helps make that case that much more strongly, and it helps real weight behind that in the creative industry. So I think more sharing, more transparency, more embedding of stuff, but also like really, really hardcore celebrating of stuff that allows us to say this is important, and also these audiences are commercial audiences and they're horribly underserved, and these makers have really interesting things to say. You won't get as exciting creative work if you are not enabling them to do that. So I think all of those things.
Yeah, that's well said. It reminds me of Sir John Tusa telling me when he took over at the Barbican, he changed what was on the stage, and that changed the audience. And it was a very big story, and he made a big, bold decision about what was currently on the stage when he took over. So if anyone has the time to look into that, he basically embodied what you've just said, Nicola. So with that, we've run out of time, I think, and I didn't see any questions in the chat. So all of you lovely people listening intently and being spammed by all of our links. So loads of homework if you want it. So Zoe, over to you, and thank you to Melanie and Nicola for a stimulating discussion and all these helpful links. Thank you for those. So over to you, Zoe.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such an amazing discussion, Nicola, Melanie, and Caroline, for facilitating it. Thank you, everyone, for attending our event. We're really grateful that you are here, and we hope you took something away from it. We shared this recording on our YouTube and send it out to you as well, and send all the links that were shared in the chat. So don't stress if you've closed some of the tabs, they will be in your inbox as well. Creative Edinburgh has some exciting things coming up. Next week, we have an event at as part of the Scottish Games Week, which is amazing. But we also have our awards, which I'll pop a link to in the chat now, coming up on the 17th of November. It's a great celebration of all the talent that's coming in the city. And yeah, it's going to be a nice party. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.